Welcome to the November 2024 episode of Diabetes Care on Air, a fun way to bring the research in diabetes care to life. My name is Alice Cheng from the University of Toronto.
And I'm Mike Rickles from the University of Pennsylvania, and we are your co-hosts for this podcast series.
Now, as per usual, Mike and I will interview authors of the feature articles selected by the editorial board of Diabetes Care, then follow up with our rapid exchange segment, where we discuss some of the articles we found of particular interest.
Now, last month in October, Alice, you celebrated Canadian Thanksgiving, and in our podcast episode, linked Thanksgiving and gratitude for being part of the American Diabetes Association community with a special promotion on now for new and renewing members of the ADA. It was a little bit corny, but I think the link worked.
And this month, Mike, it's November, which means it's the American Thanksgiving holiday. So, what are you grateful for, Mike?
Well, of course, I too am grateful for being part of the ADA community, and in the spirit of giving, would also like to share that with as many people as possible.
And to help us do that, the ADA has a special offer exclusively for new and renewing members until November 30th, 2024. When you sign up for or renew your professional membership to the ADA, use the code FALL24 or FALL24 during checkout and get 15% off the yearly membership price. And if you sign up for a 2-year membership, you'll receive the 15% discount and a very cool It Takes All of Us t-shirt from the ADA.
Remember that as an ADA member, you get access to member exclusive discounts, to conferences and other CME events, subscription to an ADA journal of your choice, copy of the Standards of Care in Diabetes, and access to an international community of professionals who share your passion and dedication to the fight to end diabetes. So if you've been considering joining the ADA or renewing your membership, now is the perfect time. And remember to take advantage of this offer by going to professional.diabetes.org/membership and use the discount code FALL24 to get 15% off a 1 or 2-year membership. This offer expires November 30th, 2024.
And don't forget the t-shirt. So, on that note, Mike, let's dive into the November 2024 issue of Diabetes Care.
In the November 2024 issue of Diabetes Care is a feature article entitled Diabetes and Driving, a statement of the American Diabetes Association. I'm delighted to welcome the article's senior author, Mr. Anthony May. Mr. May is a law partner at Brown, Goldstein, and Levy in Baltimore, Maryland. And I think this interview is a first for me on the show, and that is hosting a lawyer rather than a clinician or scientist. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective, Anthony.
Well, good afternoon, Dr. Rickles. I am absolutely thrilled to be here, and I know that doctors often like to avoid lawyers, so hopefully I don't scare too many of your listeners off, but I'm just delighted to be here. Thank you.
And Anthony, for the scientists I interview, it's typically congratulations, your work got published. But I imagine this project may have meant something different for you. Can you please tell us what led to your involvement with the ADA and the development of this statement on driving with diabetes?
Yeah, this publication really does hold a special place for me. Like a lot of people who went to law school, I went with the goal of making a difference. But as my education went along, I kind of struggled with figuring out how I was going to do that. And it really was when I graduated law school and I was about to start preparing to take the bar when my path became clear because I suddenly found myself hospitalized for 5 days. I learned that I was in DKA and I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes very later on in life. And so, fast forward a few years later, I joined Brown, Goldstein, and Levy, where I worked as a paralegal when I was an evening student in law school because of the civil rights work that they do. And I have been fortunate enough to dedicate a large portion of my practice to representing people with disabilities of all stripes, annotating equal access and things like participating in employment, in public spaces, and in government. And it's through that work that I was really able to get connected with the Americans with Diabetes Association's Legal Advocacy Subcommittee. which is a volunteer group within the ADA that helps fight discrimination against people with diabetes. And so the Driving with Diabetes statement is part of a collection of advocacy statements that our legal advocacy team works on to inform people about how the science of diabetes and the legal rights of people with diabetes interact in various settings. And as diabetes technology and the law change, we try to make sure that these statements stay up to date. And for me, it was something that I personally relied on when I was diagnosed later on with life and was trying to navigate through kind of a changing world for me.
Anthony, that's just amazing. And so glad that you and your firm have dedicated so much effort and energy into ensuring equity and access for patients living with type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes, and that the ability to be protected by the law is shared amongst those with all forms of disability and challenges, including living with diabetes. So, thank you for all that you do. Now, when it comes to driving, for most Americans, that equates to independence. And for many, their livelihoods depend on it. And your article points out that most drivers with diabetes drive safely without creating any meaningful risk of injury to themselves or others. When do individuals with diabetes and their care providers need to be concerned about potentially increased risk of operating a motor vehicle?
Yeah, there are really kind of three instances where people with diabetes and their care providers really should be focused on potential concerns or increased risk as part of driving. And the first is individuals who experience episodes of severe hypoglycemia. The second would be neuropathy that could reduce a person's capacity to feel or operate, for example, foot pedals. And the third is retinopathy or other vision related issues that could impair vision, particularly in people with diabetes, vision that's obviously very critical when you're driving.
And how do federal and state governments currently regulate diabetes and driving to mitigate risk? And what is most important of that regulatory landscape for our patients and clinicians to understand?
Sure, it's a great question. And the federal government regulates interstate commercial driving licenses and permits people with diabetes, including those who use insulin or insulin dependent, to obtain commercial driver's license. For people who use insulin, there's a certification process that they go through every year. On the other hand, states, which cover really the rest of driver license regulations, all kind of vary in their requirements state by state. Some states impose no special requirements for people with diabetes, while others question drivers with diabetes about their condition, including their management kind of procedures that they have in place, and whether they've experienced any diabetes related medical issues that would affect their ability to safely operate a motor vehicle. So it's really kind of key to check with your state's local motor vehicle administration before getting your driver's license and kind of knowing what the laws are in your specific state before you get your license renewed.
Great. And now, Anthony, regarding hypoglycemia, your article points out that clinically significant, that we refer to as level 2, or severe episodes, as you mentioned, that we refer to as level 3, both pose substantial risk to driving safety. And while it seems clear that a period of driving restriction should follow any instance of a hypoglycemia related driving mishap or severe hypoglycemia that occurs while driving, how should clinicians approach reports of severe hypoglycemia that are not driving related, such as those occurring while asleep overnight or with intense physical activity?
Yeah, the key really there is, and the most important thing I think for clinicians to know is that an approach should be individualized. And we deal with this all the time in the law that, everyone's disabilities are unique. While I'm a type 1 diabetic, that doesn't mean I'm the same as any other type 1 diabetic. And so clinicians should determine the cause of the hypoglycemia, the circumstances of the episode itself, whether it was an isolated incident, whether adjustment to diabetes management plan may mitigate that risk, and the likelihood of kind of the episode reoccurring again in the future. And I think after doing that, the clinician can make really a better determination if the person with diabetes is still safe to drive, if those changes can make them safe to drive.
Great. And your article points out some really important lessons for our patients experiencing hypoglycemia when it comes to driving. And that includes what we need to be doing as clinicians in terms of identifying those with impaired awareness of hypoglycemia, both prescribing and ensuring access to technologies such as continuous glucose monitoring. But then also, what struck me as being very important to emphasize is that still having a self monitor blood glucose meter, even if you are on a continuous glucose monitor, should be used before driving and periodically while driving for long trips. And also, what seems to be intuitive, but certainly worth making sure we talk about, yeah, correcting a low glucose before driving and pulling over if one develops while driving. So, and that last point requires, keeping a source of rapid acting carbohydrate as well as some mixed nutrient snack for a longer trip available in your vehicle. And so those types of tips are worth, continuing to reemphasize with our patients, and also what you discussed so importantly about not mixing alcohol with driving. We all know, of course, alcohol can impair driving, but that it also can exacerbate any impairment that may be a consequence of low glucose. And so that's just a really dangerous mix. And are there other additional educational interventions to point out for our patients?
Yeah, there definitely are. And I mean, those were all great points that we obviously stress in the paper. And again, were things that I had to kind of re-educate myself when I learned that my world had changed a bit. And I think it's that concept of re-education and constant continual learning that is really worth emphasizing. So it really is important to continually educate your patients on how to safely drive with diabetes, not just to diagnose or an initial diagnosis or after a hypoglycemic event, but to constantly have those conversations. Blood glucose awareness training is an additional educational intervention that's shown to reduce the occurrence of accidents and other driving violations while also improving judgment about whether or not to drive while hypoglycemic. Healthcare professionals can also provide direct educational interventions to their patients to improve awareness and develop strategies regarding preventing and managing hypoglycemia, including in the context of driving safety through DSMES or DSMT education programs. So those are all the kinds of things that I think just understanding that this is a constant evolution and that patients should be constantly reminded of these things and these conversations are ongoing.
And I'm so glad you're bringing up those really critical resources that are out there and are available, but we have to be reminded ourselves and reminding our patients to access those resources and education. Now, Anthony, regarding retinopathy and neuropathy, which, as you mentioned, can each affect vision and pedal sensation respectfully, while regular eye exams and foot exams should help to identify and address problems early, when issues do arise, what other options may be available for patients to help maintain safe driving?
Sure. So some examples that come to mind are adaptive equipment, things like hand controls, and that can be a good option for individuals with significant and lower extremity neuropathy. In terms of retinopathy, I'd say when choosing a treatment strategy, clinicians should take into consideration functional impact on vision, including driving ability, those sorts of things. But again, and it's no different from the legal world that accommodations are always ongoing and you always need to figure out kind of what tools are out there that can help.
That's great, Anthony. And finally, do you have any other takeaway messages for our listeners?
Yeah, I think the main takeaway from this statement, particularly, is that a diagnosis of diabetes on its own doesn't decide whether or not you can drive or not. That you're still able to do those things, and just because you've got a disability doesn't mean that you don't have the right to drive like everybody else. And drivers with diabetes should work constructively with their healthcare professionals, work on a team to implement strategies to stay safe while driving, to constantly educate themselves. But the statement really outlines what several of those strategies can be, and it can really be an incredible resource, like I said, for somebody like me who had no idea the world that I was entering when I was diagnosed. I think it can really be a nice resource to kind of put your mind at ease on how your life, while might be different, doesn't necessarily have to change completely. And I think I would just encourage folks, if you think that you or someone you know might have been discriminated against because of their diabetes, whether it's in accessing a driver's license or in employment or in getting public accommodations, please feel free to reach out and use the ADA, Americans with Diabetes Association, as a resource. We can be contacted at 1-800-DIABETES, or you can email us at askada@diabetes.org.
Mr. Anthony May, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge and these resources with us and our listeners, both providers and patients. It's really helpful and meaningful. And I really appreciate all I've learned from your statement that's being published in the November issue and our discussion, and know how important this information is to helping our patients and providers minimize driving risk and promote a culture, as you described, of safety surrounding driving practices that we can all be a part of. And I encourage our listeners to access the full article in the November issue of Diabetes Care.
One of the feature articles from the November 2024 issue of Diabetes Care is an impressive narrative review entitled Efficacy and Safety of GLP-1 Medicines for Type 2 Diabetes and Obesity by none other than the Dr. Daniel Drucker, endocrinologist, professor of medicine at the Lunenfeld-Tanenbaum Research Institute, Mount Sinai Hospital at the University of Toronto, recipient of countless prestigious awards, and one of Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People of 2024 for his critical role in the discovery and understanding of GLP-1. Thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this podcast, and congratulations, Dan, for pretty much everything.
Yeah, except my golf game, which you're charitable enough not to mention, Alice. Thanks. Great to be here.
Thanks so much for doing this. So in 1987, when you and your colleagues in Dr. Joel Hebner's lab published that truncated GLP-1 7 to 37 stimulated glucose-dependent insulin release from rat islet cells, did you even fathom or dream that that discovery would lead to this GLP-1 based revolution of type 2 diabetes and obesity management?
I think for the diabetes piece, there was always the hope that this would be developed as a new medicine for diabetes. There were patents filed, there were discussions with companies. Took a long time. The peptide was degraded. People felt sick when they got too much GLP-1 too quickly. But diabetes was always a focus. I think it's fair to say the obesity revolution now that we're looking at was not predicted. That basic science came almost 10 years later. And even at that time, we really didn't envision how this would change the management of people with obesity.
So since the introduction of exenatide, and it's hard to believe it was in 2005, as the first approved GLP-1 receptor agonist for the treatment of type 2 diabetes, GLP-1 based medicines in type 2 have completely exploded, not only in terms of the numbers of options, but also in its proven benefits for organ protection beyond their established metabolic benefits, such as cardiovascular, stroke, kidneys, HFpEF. And a similar pattern has emerged with the studies of GLP-1 based medicines in the treatment of obesity with benefits beyond weight loss. Now, you start your excellent overview of these developments in the beginning of your narrative review, discussing the evidence for liraglutide, dulaglutide, semaglutide, and tirzepatide. Then you go on to discuss investigational GLP-1 based medicines in the clinic, or as I like to call them, GLP-1 and Friends, which could be the title of a catchy TV show. So can you tell us more about the direction that these are in fact taking?
Yeah, so we have multiple buckets of innovation, right? So we have the new molecules that are not going to be just GLP-1, but they might be GLP-1/GIP, they might be biased, they might have glucagon, amylin, PYY, all kinds of new combinations. So that's really exciting. Then we have the new ways that we're going to deliver them. It might be small molecules, they might be antibodies. There are attempts at gene therapy, gene editing, cell-based therapy. So that's really interesting. And then the new indications, which we can talk about, well beyond type 2 diabetes and obesity, all kinds of new indications that GLP-1 has hints of efficacy that's really being carefully studied now.
Very, very exciting times ahead for sure. Now, you sort of alluded to potential use of GLP-1 medicines for other conditions. For example, metabolic liver disease, neurodegenerative diseases, addiction, and perhaps others. So where are we at with the current state of evidence around that?
So the data is going to come very fast and furious. So imminently, we've got metabolic liver disease reporting the first phase 3 trial with the Essence trial and semaglutide. We have the STRIDE trial in peripheral artery disease that should report pretty soon. We have a phase 3 academic trial with once weekly exenatide in Parkinson's disease that might report out soon. We'll have to wait about 12, 14 months for semaglutide in people with Alzheimer's disease. And then all kinds of investigator-initiated studies, as you pointed out, in neuropsychiatric conditions and looking at arthritis and almost every imaginable chronic condition. People are saying, I wonder if GLP-1 medicines might be useful. And some of the trials are underway. It's really exciting.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think, I mean, I wasn't obviously part of this discovery at the very beginning, but even just during my career, seeing this path change is actually quite exciting. And I think it's important for us in the diabetes space, given that we perhaps have the most experience clinically using these therapies, that we're going to need to start teaching our friends in other therapeutic areas to use these safely. And with that concept of safety, now let's talk about the adverse events linked to GLP-1 based medicines. Now, the GI side effects are well established, right? The nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, the increase in gallbladder related events. But there are a bunch of others that are often mentioned. And in the review, you provide some clarity regarding them. So let's start off with pancreatitis and cancer. So, what is the current understanding about the relationship or lack thereof with GLP-1 based medicine?
Yeah, so this started around 2010. We got some clinical reports of exenatide, the only drug available at the time. And then there were some preclinical studies looking at rats. And so this was quite concerning. And there was a lot of basic science and more clinical investigation. And I think today, with a large amount of real world data and 8 adjudicated cardiovascular outcome trials in people with type 2 diabetes and 1 with obesity, we can be pretty confident and say we really don't see an imbalance of pancreatitis or pancreatic cancer, either in the clinical trials or in the real world. In fact, if you're a bit of an optimist, there might actually be a reduction in pancreatic cancer when you look at the better real world data. So I think that's very reassuring, because 15 years ago, we didn't have this information and there was understandable concern about these issues.
Now, what about fractures? Because that's another one that had been mentioned about GLP-1 based medicines. What are your thoughts on that?
So, in animals, GLP-1 and GLP-2 are part of the gut hormone response that controls postprandial bone resorption. And in animals, in mice and rats, there's a GLP-1 receptor on C cells in the thyroid that also promotes, the effects of calcitonin on bone. But in humans, we don't have that calcitonin axis with GLP-1. And the data has really been limited. So, as you know, to do a dedicated osteoporosis trial, you would have to enroll a population at high risk, often postmenopausal, follow them for 3 to 5 years, look not only at bone density, but its bone quality and fractures that are important in this population. We just don't have that data. So again, the real world data does not really hint at an imbalance of bone disease, but one could argue that the proper study to really understand the bone biology has not been done with GLP-1.
Now, what about sarcopenia? So, this is a very hot topic in the last year or so.
Yeah, one of my favorite topics, because as we get more powerful medicines and we start to routinely be able to achieve 20 to 25% weight loss, we are going to see more sarcopenia. We see this with any profound weight loss, whether it's diet or bariatric surgery or the medicines, that we're going to start to see more of this. So then the question is it sarcopenia by DEXA scan, but there's no clinical functional muscle deficit? Or if we have a modest functional muscle deficit, can we counteract that with advice about nutrition, protein intake, resistance exercise, which should be part of the regimen? And then there are about a dozen medicines, different classes of medicines, that seek to prevent the loss in lean mass, and which ones will work and which ones will promote functional lean mass. And if you're a clinician, would you prescribe a medicine if there's a 20% increase in grip strength or 6-minute walk time, or would you want harder outcomes? So this is a brand new area that's really fascinating. We'll have to pay close attention.
And it's almost funny how we're now living in an era where, because of the powerful medicines that we have and are coming, we can actually we need to have this conversation, right? Because before, trying to achieve weight loss was such a struggle.
Yeah. When I was, going to the clinic as a trainee, if you could achieve 5% weight loss safely, that would have been fantastic for many people. We never would have imagined that we would be having conversations worrying about 25% weight loss. So it's a great problem to face clinically.
Absolutely. Now, another hot topic that's come up in the past year or so, which I find interesting that it's only come up in the past year or so, given how long we have had these medicines, are questions around the risk of perioperative aspiration due to retained gastric contents. And as you know, it was last year when there started to be some guidance documents that were published suggesting that things should be held. So, what are your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, this has also been fascinating because, as you point out, the first GLP-1 medicine was approved April 28th, 2005. So we have more than 19 and a half years of real world experience. And we haven't had an epidemic of aspiration pneumonia or real clinical issues. But there will be some people, particularly individuals who are reporting persistent gastric distension, persistent abdominal discomfort, ongoing, perhaps nausea and GI distress. They may be at greater risk for having retained gastric contents, and we might want to individualize our recommendations to those individuals. But there's no consensus about this. If you look at consensus guidelines coming from different societies, they all differ. So I think being aware of the problem is important. I think looking in a symptomatic individual to see whether or not they do have retained gastric contents with a point of care ultrasound is important, and making tailored recommendations based on the individual in front of us rather than sweeping recommendations that everyone should stop the medicine X weeks before procedure. I don't think that's going to serve the community well right now. So it's an important issue, but as you point out, it's not been a major problem after 19 and a half years.
And I think the tips that you just suggested are very useful for us to implement now, right? Whilst waiting for any more data and more evidence to emerge.
Yeah, endocrinologists are often in dialogue with our anesthesia colleagues. And when I was doing consults and I wanted to make sure the patient had insulin, I would not hang a drip. I would give it recommended by injection. When I wanted to make sure the person had perioperative glucocorticoid coverage, I would not hang a drip. I would give them an IM injection an hour on call to the OR because that would circumvent the potential intervention of the anesthetist who would turn off those drips. And I think now we're having the same kind of discussion with well-meaning anesthetists who are concerned, understandably, about their patients, but maybe sometimes causing more harm than good by having a blanket one-size-fits-all recommendation.
Yeah, reminder we should individualize therapy. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Now, in your narrative review, you also cover a lot more material than we have time to cover in this interview. And I certainly encourage our listeners to take a closer look to learn more about their use in children and adolescents, their impact on PCOS and fertility and pregnancy and other topics. But to finish off this interview, though, what does the future hold for GLP-1 based medicines? You sort of hinted at some of those things at the beginning, but what do you think are the other areas that remain to be explored? And what do you envision, let's say, 20 years from now in terms of how things are going to look?
So it's a great opportunity, first of all, for the more junior colleagues just entering into this field. There are just dozens of questions to answer from the bench to the bedside. I think it's very important beyond the really exciting new indications that we've discussed very briefly. Every time we have a new medicine and every time we have a new indication, we cannot fall back on this, we've had 19 and a half years of experience with GLP-1 medicines for type 2 diabetes. We don't have a huge evidence of use in young people or in people with HFpEF or in people with severe kidney disease or in people with metabolic liver disease. And then every new medicine that's not GLP-1 based, but it's like you said, friends of GLP-1 or GLP-1 plus, we don't know what the potential is for having a greater safety profile, for introducing new risks, etc. So I think that the big take-home message is we must be curious and vigilant and define very carefully the risk-benefit profile for each of these new medicines in each of the new conditions beyond type 2 diabetes and obesity. We should not be complacent and think we understand it all and now it's just a little bit of harmless innovation. We have to be careful because every once in a while what you don't know can come back and surprise you. And we owe it to our patients to be careful.
Wise words indeed. So thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Drucker, for sharing your expertise and this narrative review with us. And congratulations to you for the critical role that you and your colleagues have played in this GLP-1 based revolution that has really transformed type 2 diabetes and obesity management. I encourage our listeners to read the full review in the November issue of Diabetes Care. Let's move on now to our rapid exchange segment, where Mike and I chat about some of the articles we found particularly interesting this month. Mike, what's your first pick?
Alice, I like to start with a study coming out of your institution investigating the concept of glucose toxicity and the effect of its amelioration on beta cell function. Dr. Ravi Ratnakaran at the University of Toronto and colleagues in Ontario examined data from 108 adults with type 2 diabetes who received 3 weeks of intensive insulin therapy using glargine and Lispro insulins. Oral glucose tolerance tests were conducted before and after intervention, and the present analysis examined the relationship between baseline fasting glucose and the change in oral glucose tolerance test derived measures of beta cell function and glucose tolerance. This relationship turned out to be nonlinear, with an inflection point at a baseline fasting glucose of 9.3 millimole per liter or 168 milligrams per deciliter, above which the intensive insulin therapy intervention was associated with the greatest improvement in beta cell function and glucose tolerance. These results are consistent with reversal of glucose toxicity and suggest a fasting glucose level above which clinicians might more readily consider early insulin intervention in practice.
And those are really interesting data because, I mean, early insulin intervention has good evidence behind it in terms of potentially being able to, I don't know, wake up the pancreas, if you will. But admittedly, I struggle to implement it in practice given the unfounded stigma around insulin, particularly when someone's early in their diagnosis. And then currently, the availability of options like GLP-1 receptor agonists, I think, have also made it a little more difficult to implement. But nonetheless, I think these data at least give me something that I can tell patients to say, you know, you fit into the category where this has been shown to be particularly helpful, and maybe, just maybe, this might convince a few more people to accept it. So for me this month, my 3 picks fit the theme of diabetes through the ages, with my first pick actually starting in utero. So Dr. Meng Yang and colleagues from Tongji Medical College in Huazhong University of Science and Technology, Wuhan, China, examined the association between maternal glycemia with childhood lung function outcomes in the offspring. They looked at a birth cohort of 889 children whose mothers underwent oral glucose tolerance tests between 24 to 28 weeks gestation. At the age of 6, the children had pulmonary function testing using spirometry. 10.7% of the children were exposed to maternal gestational diabetes. The pulmonary function measurements were converted to Z scores with adjustment for age, sex, height, and ethnicity. The presence of maternal gestational diabetes was associated with reduced Z score for FEV1, which is forced expiratory volume in 1 second, FVC, which is forced vital capacity, and forced expiratory flow at 25 to 75% of FVC, with more pronounced effect in the girls. In addition, maternal GDM was associated with higher risk of impaired lung function in children with an odds ratio of 2.64, defined as SVC less than 85% of the predicted value. Remember, these are children that are age 6. There was no association with FEV1 over FVC, which is the usual marker for obstructive and restrictive airway conditions. Overall, this analysis demonstrated a negative association between maternal GDM and lung function in the offspring at 6 years of age. Many questions remain to be answered regarding the underlying mechanism of the association and the impact, if any, of the different levels of glycemic control in the pregnancy, et cetera, et cetera.
That is a fascinating association, Al, and certainly one to watch as more data are generated. And in the meantime, serves as one more reminder of the importance of identifying maternal gestational diabetes mellitus, or GDM, and addressing maternal glucose for both maternal and offspring health. And to that end, we also have in the November issue a study examining the use of continuous glucose monitoring in early pregnancy to predict maternal GDM and pregnancy outcomes. Ms. Beth Lim and colleagues from the National University of Singapore followed 103 multi-ethnic Asian women with overweight or obesity, of which 18 developed GDM based on a 24 to 28 week screening. CGM parameters obtained between 11 and 15 weeks showed excellent performance for predicting GDM, and moreover, were also associated with cesarean delivery enlarged for gestational age infants. These findings add to previous work from the US just published in the August issue of Diabetes Care and covered on this podcast, supporting the use of CGM, or continuous glucose monitoring, at the end of the first trimester. Now, here showing the results in an Asian population of women to identify impaired glucose homeostasis in pregnancy early and offer the opportunity for intervention.
And what I love about this is, I mean, everybody hates the orange drink test. And when you're talking to pregnant ladies with gestational diabetes and telling them that postpartum they have to do that orange drink test, it's a universal reaction. So this is, I think, another piece of data to support the potential use of other modalities to help predict and perhaps in the future even diagnose GDM so that people don't have to do that unpleasant orange drink test. So something to look forward to. Now, continuing along the theme of diabetes through the ages, my next pick looks at the emerging adult age group with type 1 diabetes. So, Dr. Shivani Agarwal and colleagues at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in Bronx, New York, performed a longitudinal cohort study over 4 years looking at the outcomes of a real world clinical model to support underserved young adults with type 1 diabetes compared to usual care. The real world clinical model was called the Supporting Emerging Adults with Diabetes Program, or SEED, which they developed and integrated into endocrinology care to address unmet social and medical challenges. The program was an adult based healthcare transition receivership program that included pathways focused on a few things. Number one, equal access for all young adults with type 1 diabetes ages 18 to 35 years old. Number two, health-related social needs screening and management. Number three, provider training in patient-centered equitable care focused on shared decision-making and cultural humility. And finally, enhanced access to diabetes technology. 332 young adults with type 1 diabetes were in the SEED program and were compared to 165 who received usual care. Mean age was 25 years old, mean A1C was 9.2%, and 49% had public insurance coverage. Compared to usual care, the young adults in the SEED program had lower incidence of hospitalizations, reduced by 64% for those with a baseline A1C over 9%, and reduced by 74% for those with public insurance. The SEED group also was 1.5 times more likely to use automated insulin delivery, and the A1C improvement was greater. This study demonstrated that this clinical model, called SEED, meaningfully improved clinical outcomes in underserved young adults with type 1 diabetes, and perhaps with early interventions like this, the inequities in short and long-term outcomes for this group can be reduced.
Great pick, Alice, and so important to see this work addressing underserved youth with type 1 diabetes meaningfully impacting health outcomes. What I think is most important is that SEED is a program we all can and should try implementing in our own practices. My last pick examines the intrapartum, which refers to labor and delivery, and early postpartum use of an advanced hybrid closed loop system in women with type 1 diabetes. Dr. Kat Bunin from the University of Leuven and colleagues through Belgium and the Netherlands conducted a secondary analysis of the Crystal trial that randomized 95 pregnant participants to receive insulin delivery via the Medtronic 780G pump or standard of care. And in the primary analysis showed advanced hybrid closed loop therapy improved overnight glycemic control, lowered the incidence of hypoglycemia, and improved treatment satisfaction compared to standard of care. In the current analysis, intrapartum advanced hybrid closed loop use was associated with spending significantly more time in the target glucose range of pregnancy, 3.5 to 7.8 millimole per liter, or 63 to 140 milligrams per deciliter, at 72% compared to 63% with standard of care, with no increase in time below range that was between 1 to 2% in both groups. Postpartum, both groups of women maintained more than 80% time in the typical target range of 3.9 to 10 millimole per liter, or 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter. These are welcome additional data supporting the extension of automated insulin delivery to helping women not only achieve target glycemia during pregnancy, but also throughout labor and delivery while safely maintaining a transition to the postpartum period.
So definitely welcome data, because that labor and delivery timing is obviously a stressful time, perhaps. And I think anything that can remove some of the uncertainty is always great. And being able to use automation and knowing how to do so safely is a welcome addition. So this now brings me to the final pick within the diabetes through the ages theme. And this addresses the older adults with type 2 diabetes. Dr. Pio and colleagues from Harvard Medical School compared healthcare resource utilization and costs for inpatient and outpatient services and dispensed medications in older adults with type 2 diabetes initiating empagliflozin versus a DPP-4 inhibitor. They used US Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries with diabetes 65 years of age or older, starting either empagliflozin or DPP-4 inhibitor from 2014 to 2018. After adjusting for a whopping 143 baseline covariates, they identified 23,335 matched pairs with a mean age of 72 years and 51% with baseline cardiovascular disease. Healthcare resource utilization rates were significantly lower in the empagliflozin initiating group compared to the DPP-4 initiating group. All of the following were lower in the EMPA group: inpatient days, number of emergency room visits, number of hospitalizations, and number of outpatient office visits. Costs were lower too, including inpatient and outpatient costs. So overall total cost of care was lower in the empagliflozin group despite higher diabetes medication cost. However, of note, the total cost benefit was most evident in the cardiovascular disease subgroup and attenuated in the non-cardiovascular disease group.
Thanks, Alice. That's more evidence for considering the cardiovascular benefits of SGLT2 inhibitors when prescribing glucose-lowering agents for older adults with type 2 diabetes. And I got to hand it to you for so elegantly illustrating your theme addressing diabetes across the lifespan with your picks. This takes us to the end of our November 2024 episode of Diabetes Care on Air. And a big thank you to Dr. Dan Drucker and Mr. Anthony May for sharing their expertise with us. Remember that ADA has a special offer for new and renewing members with a 15% discount on a 1 or 2 year membership if you use the code FALL24 or FALL24 online at professional.diabetes.org/membership. This offer will expire on November 30th, 2024, and go for the 2-year free t-shirt bargain. Take advantage of this great opportunity and tell your friends and colleagues.
Also remember that Diabetes Care is continuing to take submissions of original art for consideration to be included on a future journal cover. Please subscribe to get notifications about new episodes of this podcast. Thank you so much for listening.